Tashidaleg and hello everyone. Welcome to this virtual site event organized by the Tibet Bureau, Geneva. This virtual site event is being organized in parallel the UN 46th Human Rights Council session, which is currently underway here in Geneva. I'm Calvin Somo, the UN Advocacy Officer at the Tibet Bureau, and I'll be moderating today's. The central theme to discuss in today's event is current human rights situation inside Tibet. So to look into the issues, we are pleased to have with us three pertinent speakers for today's topic. Dr. Adrian Zenz, Senior Research Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, author, writer, and Tibet specialist Kate Saunders, and my colleague, Tinle Chigila, Special Appointee for Human Rights, Tibet Bureau, Geneva. A very warm welcome to all our panelists and the participants. Thank you. So, there is no doubt to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected every corner of the world very severely. As in the case of many, the work of UN Human Rights Council has been heavily affected. In particular, the access and the participation of the civil society group has been challenged since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. How lovely and powerful it would have been if we could meet in person, talk and discuss about the situation in Tibet in Palais. Nevertheless, thanks to the technology for filling this gap in this extraordinary situation, though technology cannot replace in-person meetings and discussion. So before getting into substance, at the outset, I should acknowledge our live audience, presence of representatives from various representatives from various UN permanent missions based in Geneva, and the staff from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights will be following the event at a later stage, and representatives from human rights and China-focused civil society group, Tibet supporters and Tibetans. Thank you very much for joining this event. And a very short housekeeping note to make. So we will have 15 minutes for each panelist to speak. And after that, we will open the segment, that Q&A segment. So we invite and encourage our live audience to take the opportunity to ask your question to our distinguished and most pertinent speakers for this topic, human rights situation inside Tibet, to all our panelists. So please ask your questions or write your questions in the Facebook page comment section below. And I request you to please identify yourself, your name, and if you are associated with any organization, of course, please write also the organization name and the name of the panelists to whom you are asking your questions. And after the Q&A segment, we will have the opportunity to hear the final remarks from our panelists, 2 to 3 minutes. That's a very short housekeeping note to make. Now let's hear from our panelists of today's event. And may I invite and request Dr. Adrian Zenz to speak. Dr. Adrian Zenz is a Senior Research Fellow in China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Dr. Zen is a very well-known research figure when it comes to the discussion on China's ethnic policy, Tibet and Xinjiang. Dr. Zen has extensively written on China, Beijing's internment campaign in Xinjiang, China's domestic security budgets, and in recent time, military-style vocational training in Tibet. And also, Dr. Zen has authored a book, very interesting book, titled Tibetanness and the Threat, Neo-Integrationism, Minority Education, and Career Strategies in Qinghai, and also the co-editor of Mapping Amdo, that is eastern part of Tibet, Mapping Amdo, Dynamics of Change. So Dr. Zen, your recent study and research article on military-style vocational training has been widely cited and discussed. So can you share some light on this, and what is your finding? And over to you, Dr. Zhang.
Well, thank you indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. And it's my pleasure to present on findings that transpired in the second half of last year. Let me start by contextualizing to say that since Beijing's takeover of Tibet and Tibetan regions, the relationship, of course, between the central government and the Tibetans has been marked by strong ambiguities and conflict. After the devastating repressions of the Cultural Revolution, then the era under Deng Xiaoping marked a period of relative cultural and religious freedoms, the reopening of monasteries and sort of a revival of Tibetan education. In the Tibet Autonomous Region, as China defines it, with the capital of Lhasa, many of these freedoms did not quite last as long as in other parts of the country. So we often have to look at the different policy context in that particular part of Tibetan regions, which excludes the Amdo and almost all of the Kham Tibetan regions, which are located in Sichuan and Qinghai and Gansu provinces. Already in the early 2000s, under then Hu Jintao, some of the early gains in Tibetan education were dialed back, giving way to a more strongly integration of Tibetans with culturally and linguistically into the rest of the nation. So in this context, my latest research uncovers a troubling new development, specifically for the Tibet Autonomous Region, although it's possible that some of these discoveries also apply to other Tibetan parts. But my research on coercive vocational training and labor placements specifically focuses on the Tibet Autonomous Region as defined by Beijing. It includes the discovery that Xinjiang's coercive labor program, which was developed in recent years particularly and became increasingly coercive, has been reapplied to Tibet. So we do need to understand that the so-called labor transfer scheme, the transfer of rural surplus laborers, defined as excessive agricultural workforce that's considered to be non-productive or lesser productive because of defined over ratio of people to the land as defined by the government, to transfer them from the primary industrial sector into the tertiary or secondary or tertiary sectors. These initiatives, of course, began in China in the 1990s with the rural collective, the TVEs, the township enterprises, and the rural industrialization in China. In Tibet and Xinjiang, labor transfer initiatives started in the early 2000s, initially sporadically, and then became more and more systematic. In the case of Tibet, we see that from 2012, the Chamdo region in particular pioneered a military-style training for surplus labor force transfer for pastoral and agricultural regions. That was then formally established in the regions in Chamdo's 13th five-year plan, which runs from 2016 to 2020. And the goal was to train 65,000 laborers, surplus laborers, mostly pastoralists, but also farmers, under this policy. And the policy included also urban unemployed persons. So it was targeting unemployed and what was perceived to be underemployed. Of course, this is very much also what constitutes a rural surplus laborer can be a very subjective assessment on the side of the government in order to take Tibetans away from their traditional lifestyle and transfer them into sort of a so-called modern or more government-controlled lifestyle. Whether these so-called surplus laborers are really economically is a different question. An important watershed moment took place in March 2019. At that time, the Tibet Autonomous Region issued a very important new policy called the Farmer and Pastoralist Training and Labor Transfer Action Plan. Besides military drill, the vocational training process included, or said it must include, work discipline, Chinese language, lectures on Chinese law and work ethics, with the aim to enhance the laborer's sense of discipline to comply with national laws and regulations. So a little bit similar to Xinjiang, we see a real racking up of the coercive nature of these vocational trainings and the labor transfer, becoming much more stringent, structured, militarized, mandatory, and top-down, and coercive, the coercive nature. In Xinjiang, we saw a drastic increase in the coercive nature of labor transfer, especially after Xi Jinping's visit to Xinjiang in 2014. And the increasing promulgation or propagation of fine-grained poverty alleviation, which really began in late 2014 and then became increasingly coercive, especially under the Party Secretary Chen Quanguo, who of course was previously Party Secretary of Tibet. A very, very important similarity. In Xinjiang, Chen Quanguo came in power in August 2016 and very quickly instigated much more coercive labor training and transfer in Xinjiang in early 2017. This labor training and transfer in Xinjiang operates separately from the vocational internment camps and the internment campaign. These are two separate systems. And therefore, what we see in Tibet, we see a replication of the generally coercive labor transfer scheme, which applies to the general population, people who typically have never been in some kind of camp or re-education. But the labor training itself can lock people into camp-like settings, into re-education. Well, there are some re-education-like components, but it's not correct to call the facilities re-education camps. But Xinjiang in 2018, a fully fledged forced labor scheme based directly on the vocational internment and re-education camps. What we see in Tibet, or what we have evidence for in Tibet, let's put it this way, is a replication of the generally coercive rural surplus labor transfer, which is also forced labor, but does not require a large-scale internment or re-education campaign. I believe there is, of course, re-education, and there are camps in Tibet, but they are not, as far as we know, as systematic, as large-scale as in Xinjiang. So increasingly, with the new policy in 2019, the labor transfers in the Tibet Autonomous Region were to follow an order-oriented method by which the job is first arranged based on the need of a company. So the company can say, we need these many laborers of this skill. The government then takes them and pre-arranges and trains them for that and then sends them off to their work. That's basically almost exactly how the labor transfer in Xinjiang also works. In 2020, the Tibet Autonomous Region introduced a region-wide labor transfer policy that now established quotas for transferring rural surplus laborers to within Tibet, so shifting people between parts of Tibet, between prefectures, similar to Xinjiang, which leads to like a form of displacement because people are now no longer anywhere near their home region, with a quota of 55,000 Tibetans for 2020 and 5,000 to be transferred to other parts of China, which of course is a scheme that we have seen in Xinjiang, quotas for transferring Uyghurs to other parts of China, now the same for Tibetans to be transferred to factories in eastern China or central China. In the first 7 months of 2020, the Tibet Autonomous Region has claimed to train over 500,000 rural surplus laborers. Of them, nearly 50,000 were transferred to other parts of the TAR and 3,100 to other parts of China. Each prefecture and county was assigned a specific transfer quota. By 2020, the scheme must cover the entire Tibet Autonomous Region. And in fact, in the end of 2020, the government said, yes, we have achieved the quota. We've transferred, I think it was 600. They have achieved the 600,000. And quota fulfillment. Job placements include work in road construction, in cleaning, so, mostly low-skilled work in mining, cooking, driving, restaurant services, security jobs, beauty-related work, and so on. These kind of motorcycle, car repair, etc., maintenance. Workers are transferred to their destination in a centralized group-style point-to-point fashion, similar to the way Uyghurs are transferred to other parts of Xinjiang or to other parts of China, unified. The similarities to Xinjiang's coercive training scheme are many. Both schemes have the same target group, a high-powered focus on mobilizing a reticent minority group to change their quote-unquote lazy ways, their backward traditional lifestyles, their quote-unquote backward views on employment, and get them into modern laborers. The central terminology employed for labor transfer process identical. It's, to quote, unified matching, unified organizing, unified management, and unified sending off. Both the schemes in Xinjiang and Tibet employ military drill, closed military training style training management, at least for some of the skills training, to produce discipline and obedience. They emphasize the need to quote-unquote transform the workers' thinking and identity, to reform their backwardness, to weaken the perceived negative influence of religion, which is claimed to induce passivity, and prescribe detailed quotas and put great pressure on officials to achieve targets. There's a huge amount of pressure for the government to achieve these prescribed targets and quotas because these are poverty alleviation goals. And of course, we all know by the end of China was supposed to have eradicated poverty, Xi Jinping's signature goal. And this goal was duly announced to have been achieved. There was a celebration recently, etc., etc. So there was a huge amount of pressure. But the pressure is ongoing now to keep people out of poverty. Photographic evidence shows Tibetans training, wearing military fatigues, or wearing the dress that they're supposed to be like restaurants, etc. Official documents outline, the assignment of low-skilled jobs, the gratitude to the Chinese Communist Party, how they're lining up, all are nicely lined up and obedient and all do what they're told to do. Some of the reports I've reviewed claim that Tibetan religion cultivates backward thinking and that this is being overcome by the labor transfer. For Tibet's labor transfer scheme, there's not quite yet the evidence of highly securitized transfers with accompanying police officers for transfers outside of Tibet. But obviously, this is subject to much further research. Also, the forced labor implications, like the implication of possibly even Western companies, are much less clear, partially because they tip often into very low-skilled, like food processing. China, some of these processed food products, it's unclear to what extent they have any link to Western supply chains or not. The Training and Labor Transfer Action Plan establishes strict administrative procedures and manages the establishment of dedicated government work groups on all levels, grassroots to higher, and the involvement of top leadership cadres to ensure that the target tasks are completed on schedule. Each administrative level is to pass on the pressure to the next lower level. Local government units are to, quote, establish a task progress list, and those who lag behind the work schedule are to be reported and held accountable. The achievements are directly weighed in a cadre's annual assessment scores, complemented by a system of strict rewards and punishments. Very important in the coercive nature of the process is done by village-based work teams, a social control mechanism established by Chen Quanguo. And so many of the police state and social control mechanisms that were set up by Chen Quanguo, who was Party Secretary of Tibet between 2011 and 16, are crucial in the system, and of course are also being used in Xinjiang. The same systems apply to Xinjiang. A particularly concerning aspect of the scheme is to promote a scheme by which local nomads and farmers are asked to hand over their land and herds to large-scale state-run cooperatives. Nomads become shareholders as they convert their usage rights into shares and become wage laborers. The scheme really harks back to the forced collectivization era of the 1950s. In Nakchu, this is referred as the one township, one cooperative, one village, one cooperative scheme, indicating a very universal coverage. One account describes the land transfer as leading Tibetans to put down the whip, walk out of the pasture, and enter the labor market. My final conclusion, as I wrap up here, there's significant cause for concern that these programs are bringing long-term changes in Tibetan lifestyles and livelihoods that are coercive and mandatory, non-optional, and accompanied by a profound loss of tradition, culture, spirituality, and a substantial increase in government control over their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zen, for uncovering this very disturbing development and policies and Chinese schemes under which Tibetans are forced to undergo this forced labor, and also highlighting some of the catchy terms, Chinese terminologies, and also how China is using the language of poverty elevation to destroy Tibetan culture, identity, and religious aspects of the people. So thank you very much, Dr. Zen, for this very insightful, quick overview of what's happening in the Tibet, in particular the military-style vocational training. Thank you, Dr. Zen. Now, may I request Kate?
Thank you.
Kate to speak. Kate is an author, writer, and Tibet specialist. As a writer and journalist, Kate is closely following the situation in Tibet. And Kate was also former communication director of the International Campaign for Tibet, working with global media, government, and scholars. So Kate's articles have appeared in publications worldwide, including the Sunday Times, The Guardian, and the Washington Post. And Kate is known for her very insightful reports on Tibet, and also has written a book called 18 Layers of Hell, Stories from the Chinese Gulag, that's about Chinese Laogai system. So Kate, you have been working and closely following the situation in Tibet for now many, many years. So can you just give us an overview of what's happening in Tibet?
Thank you, Kaldenla. I'll just share the screen because I've got just some photographs to show you. Okay. Okay, have the pictures come up? I'm sure they have.
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. It was a long time ago that I wrote this book that you mentioned, Kalden, about the Chinese Laogai system, and I never imagined that I'd be going back to some of the source documents on this system to look at comparative situation in Xinjiang and the development of the policies. So I'm going to give a broad overview, as you requested, with a focus on the violations of religion, cultural rights, and minority rights. And I'm going to begin with just speaking about the life and death of a Tibetan called Kunchok Jimper, who was 51 years old. Kunchok Jimper had become a monk as a child at a monastery in an area called Driru in Nagchu, which is now the Tibet Autonomous Region. In October, in the late 1980s, he made the dangerous journey into exile in India via Nepal, where he studied for about 18 months at a monastery in Dehradun. In the 1990s, Kunchok Jimper studied as a layman at a school run by the Tibetan exile community at Suja in Himachal Pradesh. And he undertook further studies at the Higher Tibetan Studies Institute in Varanasi, where he became proficient in English and Hindi as well as Chinese and Tibetan. And he returned to Tibet in the late 1990s and took up a job as a tour guide. He was highly respected and popular, and flowing from his study in exile, he was keen to stress the importance of education and economic development in his community. And like many Tibetans at that time, he made several return visits to India. His last visit was to attend Kalachakra teachings by the Dalai Lama in 2012 in India, in Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha was enlightened. Now, at that time, a new party secretary, Chen Quanguo, was in charge in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And as Adrian has said, Chen is now in charge from 2016 in Xinjiang. And it's been well documented by Adrian and others that prior to implementation in Uyghur areas, Tibet served effectively as a lab to pioneer and trial oppressive and dystopian control measures that were then amplified and accelerated in Uyghur areas, with millions of Uyghurs subjected to mass internment and forced labour, and some then reapplied in Tibetan areas, as we've been hearing. Now, while there is not at present the same mass incarceration in camps in Tibet, nor forced labour on the same scale, coercive policies are being applied in Tibet with a rigour and an urgency that's lacking in other parts of the PRC. And China is using similar control and securitization methods in Tibetan and Uyghur areas. So Chen Quanguo trialed a process of breaking connections and routes in Tibet on a far smaller scale than in Xinjiang in 2012, when he targeted this Kalachakra teaching that Kunchok Jimper had attended in Bodh Gaya. After this teaching, hundreds of Tibetans were detained for re-education after returning from Bodh Gaya. And this was a highly systematic operation that involved keeping Tibetans under surveillance in India, as well as tracking their return. And previously to this, as we know, over the 20 years before, around 2008, 2012, many thousands of Tibetans had travelled to teachings by the Dalai Lama in exile, including many elderly Tibetans spending their life savings just to be there once in their lives. 3 years later, in 2015, Chen Quanguo boasted that by then, no one in the Tibet Autonomous Region had left the country to participate in religious teachings by the 14th Dalai clique in foreign countries. So, to go back to Kunchok Jimper's story, the year after the detentions following the Kalachakra in October 2013, the crackdown deepened in Kunchok Jimper's home area of Driru, which is Biru in Chinese. And in October of that year, Chinese officials demanded that Tibetans display Chinese flags from every house. Many Tibetans refused to do so, and there were detentions. When a young Tibetan writer and monk were detained, there were peaceful protests for their release. And on October the 6th, 2013, troops opened fire on Tibetans, calling for the release of a local Tibetan who had objected to orders from a patriotic education work team. So among the hundreds of people who were detained in the crackdown were Kunchok Jimper, and he's believed to have simply provided information about the crackdown and the protests to media outside Tibet, Tibetan media outside Tibet, and he was immediately detained, and he apparently provided information also about mining on a sacred mountain. And in a final communication on WeChat, he wrote, "I'm now at the bank of a river. There are many people behind me watching me, and I'm sure to be arrested. From now on, I will not be able to give reports. If there is no word from me, that means I have been arrested." So Driru became an information black hole. It became impossible for Tibetans outside Tibet to know what was happening there. And a few weeks ago, 8 years after his initial arrest, information emerged that Kunchok Jimper had been sentenced to 21 years in prison for sending the news about the crackdown outside Tibet. And as Human Rights Watch observed, this is an unparalleled sentence for such an offence. Kunchok Jimper died in hospital in Lhasa on February the 6th, 2021, less than 3 months after being transferred there from prison without his family's knowledge. Apparently, he'd suffered a brain hemorrhage and he was paralyzed. Kunchok Jimper's life and death tells us exactly how much China wants to prevent us from knowing anything about what is happening in Tibet. And it tells us about the scope and scale of this current crackdown, and also the human cost of direction. In August last year, a new phase of China's strategy in Tibet was set in place at a top-level conclave, the 7th Tibet Work Forum. And that was presided over by Xi Jinping, and it established the direction of policy over the next 5 to 10 years. And this involves a dramatic expansion and strengthening of the CCP's coercive capability in Tibet. And that has the objective, as the official media frame it, of breaking lineage, breaking roots, breaking connections, and breaking origins. And this is meant literally. Previously, a younger generation of Tibetans would have learnt about their country's history in the privacy of the family home or from elders at a monastery. They would have learnt about the Chinese invasion, the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, the destruction of monasteries and nunneries, the reasons for the Dalai Lama's escape in 1959. But cutting off these transmissions has been identified by the Communist Party as a priority, and that's reflected in their objective of breaking the roots and the connections at the heart of Tibetan Buddhist beliefs and civilization. And that involves the intangible as well as the tangible elements that form an identity. Hyper-securitization is no longer enough. This has to be accompanied by ideological indoctrination and re-education. In classic Chinese statecraft, there are 2 tools for gaining and maintaining control. The first is wu, meaning weapons and violence, and the second refers to language and culture. And as a Chinese official told Western journalists on a press trip to Tibet last November, it's a political imperative to fix Tibetan minds or to instill the red gene, to put it in another way. And this is a still from some of the TV coverage of that press visit to Tibet last November. And the reporter, Olivia, is in someone's home looking at the pictures of the Chinese leader they're now required to display in their own homes. So the protests in Hong Kong and the imposition of the national security law have only hardened Xi Jinping's drive to transform ethnic cultures, pathologize dissent and diversity. And the emphasis on Chinese cultural nationalism is now the main thread of China's ethnic policies. So it's policies in both Tibet and Xinjiang. And in Tibet, these policies of coercive assimilation that we see now are really the culmination of a much more systematic approach that was developed after 2008, when hundreds of overwhelmingly peaceful protests swept across the Tibetan plateau just prior to the Olympic Games in Beijing. And these policies, this new direction, represents really an escalated threat to Tibet's linguistic, cultural, and religious identity that far surpasses previous political campaigns and policy measures. So thanks to the painstaking work of Adrian and others, the world now knows the horrifying scale of mass internment, torture, and rape of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which adjoins Tibet to the north. And that's raised important questions about the parallels and the differences with the situation in Tibet. Both Xinjiang and Tibet are of major geopolitical importance for China. Taken together, they account for more than half of its territory, and given borders with India and Pakistan, the region is a tri-nuclear junction. And we see recently how the language of the CCP on Tibet has changed to reflect this geopolitical importance. Tibet is, as they term it, a strategic resource reserve for China. The water is particularly important. It's the source of most of Asia's major rivers, and therefore of critical importance at a time of regional grave water scarcity. And so in both areas, the expression of distinct religious and ethnic identities is conflated with separatism and even terrorism, with the use of extremist language to blur distinctions between violent acts and peaceful dissent. And there are important differences in policy between Tibet and the Uyghur areas of the PRC, which Adrian touched on. I'll just run through a couple of the main ones. There is a much larger and more concentrated potential workforce in Xinjiang and a stronger industrial economy. Xinjiang has closer ties to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road project, which is part of its component so-called Silk Road economic belt. And that's given its geographical location, population, and greater accessibility. In the TAR, there is simply not the same connection to global supply chains as there is in Xinjiang. And in Tibet, as Adrian has said, there is not the same mass incarceration in prison camps and forced labour on the same scale in Xinjiang. The overwhelmingly peaceful, spontaneous protests of 2008 and the self-immolations that followed from 2009 onwards in Tibet have now largely been rendered impossible almost by a regime of intense surveillance, extreme controls on communication, and the extension of state presence to the rural grassroots. But that is not to say that the coercive capability is not present if the situation changes. So we can summarize the current human rights situation in Tibet as a combination of systematic measures bringing together ideological indoctrination beginning in childhood, the restructuring and dismantling of rural economies through mass relocation, labour mobilisation and transfer programmes, and other measures, and a systematic intensification of data-driven policing and surveillance. The current party chief of the Tibet Autonomous Region is called Wu Ying-jae, and he's the successor to Chen Quanguo, now transferred. And Wu Ying-jae is deeply associated with the intense crackdown in Driru, and therefore the death in custody of Kunchok, Jimper, and others. Now Wu Ying-jae is leading the implementation of a drive to create a sinicized, dissociated from the Dalai Lama. And the intention seems to be that future generations will only remember the Dalai Lama as an enemy. And the CCP intends to separate the Dalai Lama from religion in the minds of Buddhists in Tibet, and in the words of Wu Ying-jae, to separate religion from life. They mean that religious beliefs must not affect Tibetans' everyday lives or influence their social behaviour. And this shift, in effect, means that the CCP intends to create a Buddhism which is shaped by the atheist Communist Party that entirely excludes the Dalai Lama and seeks to obliterate his influence. And even though religion and a deep connection to the Dalai Lama are integral to Tibetan identity, this effort is, in effect, focused on generations to come. So the Chinese Communist Party wants to create an environment in which they can maintain absolute control as the Dalai Lama ages and during and beyond the period of succession. So the Beijing leadership has a mantra in Tibet, which is to maintain long-term stability. And this has come to mean not only complete compliance to party diktats and the crushing of all dissent, but also the creation of a society in which dissent is not even thought about, as ideas that differ from those of the party state are seen as the root causity. And when we study recent trends in Tibet, it does seem as though the concept means something much more than that. It doesn't only mean to stop any form of protest or to prevent dissent. It's aimed at the heart of what it is to be Tibetan now. Buddhism is central to Tibetan lives, and the Communist Party wants to break that connection not only physically by separation from the Dalai Lama and his teachings, but in every way. They're seeking to replace that loyalty with a total dependence on the party, and at the same time an active engagement in the process of building Chinese cultural nationalism. Calden, I don't know if I still have time to show the last couple of slides. I'll carry on anyway. So just the last couple of slides. At the 7th Tibet Work Forum, Xi Jinping emphasized an intensification of ideological education that's been intensified from childhood onwards. And this involves new methods of shaping and controlling minds from an early age in order to secure the loyalty of a new generation to the Chinese Communist Party. So toddlers from the age of 2 now are being deprived of their mother tongue, bedrock of Tibetan culture, with Chinese language being emphasized in new and expanded kindergartens across the Tibetan plateau. And this political agenda has led to the blacklisting of Tibetan Pure Land language groups, where elders and young people engage in conversation in their own language. It leads to the imprisonment of Tibetan language advocates like Tashi Wangchuk, who was released from a 5-year prison sentence recently but is still not free. Gendon Lundrup, a monk and poet, was arrested in December, shortly after the publication of an anthology of poems. In June last year, 36-year-old Lundrup Dragpa was sentenced to 6 years in prison for performing a song called Black Hat, which was critical of current oppression in Driru in central Tibet, where Kunchok Jimper died. Kando Seton, in the meantime, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for writing a song praising the Dalai Lama. So Adrian has effectively documented the CCP's ambitious targets of transferring Tibetans from the agricultural sector to wage labour in urban areas. And these policies also target the heart of Tibetan identity in other ways too. For generations, Tibetan nomadic herders have made a sustainable living uniquely adapted to the conditions of the Tibetan plateau, and migrating with their herds of yak, goats and sheep according to the seasons of the year, producing wool, butter, cheese, yogurt and meat, and they've served as stewards protecting wildlife and the grasslands. But long established policies to settle nomads and to transform the landscape with massive urbanization are now threatening the survival of this way of life. And the party calls this building a new socialist countryside. And just before the 7th Tibet Work Forum in August last year, the State Council issued a set of instructions on policy direction which involved the mass mobilization of labour from rural to urban and semi-urban areas. And the aim, of course, is to secure more effective control of the population, to integrate Tibetans into the PRC and to undermine ethnic unity. And we see the same process of urbanization, the destruction of villages and towns in Uyghur areas too. And in this case, the transfer of rural Tibetans into the urban wage economy emerges from the devastating impacts of the resettlement policies over 2 decades. So in Tibetan areas of Qinghai, more than 90% of the herder population has been moved into concrete block encampments in semi-urban areas far from their grasslands. So Tibetans who've been wrested from their land and livelihoods are often left with no sustainable means to provide for themselves and their families. Subsidies run out. These people are often called, well, they're defined by the party as surplus rural labour, drafted into training programs and new jobs in urban areas. which does not take into account the fact, of course, that these are highly skilled individuals used to providing for families in difficult conditions with highly specialist knowledge. And I'll conclude with this slide. These images were created by a Tibetan artist in Tibet, representing views and experiences of Tibetans inside Tibet under these much harsher policies of displacement and control.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you, Kate, for giving us very compelling and chilling insights on situation in Tibet. And also thank you very much for bringing the case of Kunchok Jimper, highlighting the human life and human cost involved in sharing or passing information to and for Tibet. And also a Beijing shift on religions. So you have very powerfully speak us or give us insights on how now the situation in Tibet is becoming bad to worse and much far beyond grim situation. So thank you very much, Kate, for this insightful presentation. Now let us move on to our final and third speaker, Tinle Chugila, my colleague Tinela. So Tinle Chugi is a special appointee for human rights at Tibet Bureau, Geneva. Before joining Tibet Bureau, she is the researcher for UN, EU, and human rights desks of the Central Tibetan Administration. Tinela has addressed and spoke at various conferences highlighting the situation in Tibet. Tinela, she has a master's degree in law from the Harvard Law School. So Tinela, you are monitoring the human rights situation inside Tibet on daily basis. So could you share us your insights on situation inside Tibet with the context of current 46th UN Human Rights Council session, which is currently taking place now here in Geneva. So with this 46th Human Rights Council session's agenda, could you share us your insights on this?
Thank you so much, Kaldila, for the brief introduction. It is an honor and a privilege to share the panel with Dr. Zenz and Ms. Saunders. Their work are basically being followed by everybody who is interested not only in human rights issues, but China in general. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Tashidele and warm greetings from Geneva to all our viewers. I just wanted to first of all say that a lot of topic has already been covered by both the speakers before me, and I think my work is much more oriented towards contextualizing it to the current UN session. In this regard, I want to quote the recent quote by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Just last week, while addressing a gathering, he said, "Places inhabited by ethnic minorities such as Xinjiang and Tibet have stood out as shining examples of China's human rights progress." When I heard this, the first thought that came to my mind was, what is shining and what has progressed? And in this regard, I thought that it would be very appropriate to look at the human rights situation inside Tibet and contextualize it to the current UNHRC session because of the paucity of time. Just wanted to highlight that out of the 44 thematic special procedures at the UN, for this current UNHRC session, there are around 13 special procedures who are presenting their reports. And out of the 30-odd human rights that are being enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, some of them are being discussed. And because of, again, the paucity of time, I would like to limit to few of the special rapporteurs and their reports, and how we can understand what exactly is Shining and what has progressed in Tibet, as said by His Excellency Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi. Starting with, of course, Ms. Saunders has covered the cultural rights issues, as well as the freedom of religion, which is being violated. There has been systematic persecution of Tibetan Buddhists in Tibet. We have seen the recent cases of laws being passed to curtail even as simple as Sangsuel, that is nothing but burning of incense and offering of incense and such religious practices, as well as pulling down prayer flags. The Tibetan older generation, the older men and women, are being stopped from going to Kora. The younger Tibetans are stopped from entering the monasteries, basically becoming receiving ordination, as well as you see the parents being stopped from practicing, and as well as orienting their kids to the religious practices of Tibetan Buddhists. So in this regard, you see that there is, in a Tibetan's life, every age and facet of a Tibetan's life, especially when it comes to the religious practices, is being controlled and subjugated by the Chinese authorities. Secondly, of course, Dr. Zenz has given such an incredible disclosure, as well as a very distinct analysis of what is happening with the militarized forced labor camps in Tibet. He records that over 500,000 Tibetans are being subjected to these labor camps. Moving on with these, I thought that I should concentrate on the torture. The Special Rapporteur on Torture is presenting the report. The Special Rapporteur is concentrating on how the cooperation of countries are impacting in their work schedule. And no guesses here, China is, even though it has not been named as so, is one of the countries which is definitely not cooperating per se with the functioning of the Special Rapporteur. Now, again, when talking about what is shining and progressed in Tibet, the recent case of Kunchok Jimper, a very, very sad case, because he was sentenced to 21 years of imprisonment for sharing news about protests in his village, and his family had no information about him since 2013, when he was detained. And just weeks before his death, the family members got to know about his condition, and he was admitted in the hospital while serving the sentence with brain hemorrhage, and was paralyzed. This is nothing but death due to torture, as well as a custodial death. And then again, the case of a 19-year-old Tibetan monk, Tenzin Nyima, from Zawangpu, who died on 19th January 2020. It is again one of the heart-wrenching cases, because he was arrested twice in 2019 for participating in a peaceful march protest. And the second arrest happened because he shared the news about his previous arrest. And during his detention, he was tortured so severely that he went into coma, and he was hospitalized. The hospitals refused to treat him, declaring that his injuries were beyond treatment. And then he succumbed to his injuries. Adding insult to injury, what the Chinese authorities did was the Chinese court slapped a summons on him, asking him to appear before the court for participating in the protest while he was in coma and dying. Again, another case of torture we have is Lamu. In August 2020, she died in detention, and her only crime was connecting and contacting her relatives in exile in India. And with this, understanding and the facts, one wonders what exactly is shining in Tibet and what has progressed in Tibet. Maybe perhaps the techniques of torture has progressed in Tibet, and what is shining is the blood and the tears of Tibetans suffering torture in Tibet. Moving on to the human rights defenders. Again, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders is presenting the report. This session's report is focusing on death threats. What we have seen is that when it comes to Tibetans, the death threats are not from private individuals or from private corporations. It is basically from the Chinese government and the Chinese police and the Chinese judiciary, because there is, first of all, no fair trial possible. There is arbitrary detention, and and if at all they survive the torture, they are incarcerated for such long periods of time that when they come out of the prison, they are basically not able to lead a normal life. We have seen systematic persecution of Tibetan human rights defenders, be it language rights advocates, cultural rights advocates, land rights advocates, or environmentalists. There has been systematic persecution of Tibetan human rights defenders, period. And for example, there are so many examples to quote from, but definitely would like to focus on Angyak Sengdra, who fought against corruption, who stood for the land rights of his community, and he was incarcerated despite communication from special rapporteurs from the UN asking him for his release. His appeal was rejected and his sentencing was upheld. Of course, another prominent human rights defenders that comes to mind is the case of Tashi Wangchuk. His crime was that he spoke for his mother language rights, and he gave an interview about it to the New York Times. His case was followed extensively by the international community. There was very strong pressure from all corners. However, despite that, China refused to release him before completion of his sentence. He was recently released, but the release seems to be very partial. He is not allowed to go outside, meet his friends or family, and his rights seem to be suspended so far. Of course, again, there is the case of Sonam Palden, so on and so forth. Once again, I would like to repeat that there is systematic persecution of Tibetan human rights defenders. Thirdly, the Special Rapporteur on Right to Food is presenting the report. In this regard, I would like to state that the case of the nomads have been discussed earlier. The case of the forced militarized labor has been discussed earlier. Connecting that to the right to food, what we see is that the forced resettlement of Tibetan nomads and semi-nomads and the illegal land grabs of the farmers and the nomads is causing them to leave their sustainable lifestyle, the nomads and the Tibetan farmers who have lived a very independent life so far are now forced to live in an urban dwelling structure where there is concerted control and monitoring of their movements. Secondly, they are being forced to depend on the welfare schemes of the Chinese authorities. And this is again a very, very strategic move, because once you are enrolled in the welfare schemes of the Chinese authorities, which are presented as a means of poverty alleviation, the Tibetans become dependent on it. They are no longer able to lead an independent life or sustainable lifestyle, and because of this dependency, they are forced to adhere to certain arbitrary rules and regulations and give up their basic human rights. Again, there is a question of right to housing. The Special Rapporteur on right to housing was supposed to present the report this session. However, due to paucity of time, this session. In this session, the rapporteur will not be presenting the report, and it has been postponed to the next session. Similarly, there is a question of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and of course, environmental degradation. Next, what I would like to concentrate on is who has evaluated that the human rights in Tibet has progressed, and Tibet has become the shining example. In this regard, I would like to highlight that there has been no visit from UN Human Rights High Commissioner since 2005. In fact, China did extend last year an invitation, but because of the COVID, there has been a delay, and we are not very sure if the visit will happen or not. And even if the visit does take place, they are concentrating on Xinjiang, and again Tibet, because of how they have walled Tibet behind, not just firewalls but also travel bans. The visit to Tibet seems to be unlikely, though we are pushing for it and we are hoping for it. Again, have there been any visits by the special rapporteurs? No. The last special rapporteur to visit was the special rapporteur on older persons. That was in 2019. We have not have seen any visit to Tibet. I think the last visit of the special rapporteur on torture was in 2005. Again, in that report, the special rapporteur visited Lhasa and discusses how there has been, torture in the name of re-education through labor camps. Again, there has been no visit from Special Rapporteur on Food, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion. The last visit was in 1994, no visit so far. The Human Rights Defenders, the last visit was in 2005, no visit so far. There have been multiple requests from many special rapporteurs, but so far China has refused to accept their request and facilitate a visit. Discussing this, what about the treaty mechanism? China has, time and again postponed submitting any kind of report to the treaty bodies. There is no UPR recommendation plan. There is no midterm UPR report submitted. Of course, there is the Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. They have submitted a report, and we are hoping that the evaluation will take place this year, so on and so forth. So basically, there is no verifiable, independent analysis of the human rights situation on ground in Tibet. Over and above this, not just the Tibetans who are inside Tibet, Tibetans outside Tibet are also facing repression. The recent Freedom House report on highlighting the case of Tibet and of course China on transnational repression, and then you wonder, is this the progress that His Excellency Wang Yi was referring to, that China has progressed from repressing Tibetans not just in Tibetan, but it has progressed to repressing Tibetans outside Tibet as well? One wonders. Of course, again, there are cases of reprisals being mentioned, and China is one of the prominent countries that has been highlighted in the UN Secretary General's report so far. In conclusion, what I would want to once again say is that we do not know how His Excellency Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, came to the conclusion that China has progressed and Tibet is a shining example of China's human rights progress. One must definitely say that, and I would want to repeat, is that what has progressed is the tactics, of China, the strategies of China, the innovative means of China to suppress, repress, and violate the human rights of Tibetans. And what is shining through are the tears and the bloods of Tibetans who are suffering not just from the direct control and subjugation of Tibetans by the Chinese authorities, but also from torture and custodial deaths. That's all from my end, Kaldenla.
Dilla, thank you so much. Thank you very much for sharing your take and analysis on China's Foreign Secretary Remark during the high-level segmentation in this ongoing 46 UN Human Rights Council session. So it's very interesting. And also thank you for touching upon the cases and challenges faced by the human rights defenders. So thank you very much. Now moving on to Q&A segment. We haven't received many questions. So we have received just one question from Kunchok. So he or she has written in Tibetan asking. So it's very open because there he or she hasn't mentioned the panelist name. So it's very open question. So any of you, please. And the question is, in these days, Tibetans inside Tibet are forced to put the photo or portrait of the Chinese Communist Party leaders on the altar, whereas the photo of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is banned, and just possessing the photo of His Holiness is illegal. So, but Tibetans inside Tibet are forced to keep the portrait or photos of the Communist Party's leaders. So what is your take on this? And share some insights, if any. So maybe we begin with Adrian, Kate, Chilila. So maybe one or two, because we have now 15 more minutes. So who will go first for responding to this question?
Yeah, question. Yeah. Of course, Ketla would know more, but what I have monitored and noticed is that, of course, it's not just the pictures that are being forced to be kept in the altar, but also, in the name of Mao, there have been many temples that are being built in China, and eventually we fear that it might come to Tibet as well, where Tibetans are then forced to do the Kora, and which is basically the circumambulation of Mao temples as well. This is, of course, a very, very difficult situation, especially considering that Tibetans are not allowed to keep pictures of their own religious leader, of their own spiritual guru, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and are forced to keep pictures of Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping. And I often say that unless Mao Zedong, or unless His Excellency Xi Jinping is planning to start his own religion and his own cult, definitely forcing Tibetans to worship to his pictures will not amount to freedom of religion whatsoever. And we categorically object to this forcing of Tibetans to worshipping such pictures. That's all.
Okay, Ketla, you have anything to add? Kate?
Sorry, I was just muted. I would say that this is the progression from banning the pictures of the Dalai Lama, which really began in the mid 1990s, and so we've seen a policy arc from the patriotic education campaigns of the mid 1990s, when the Dalai Lama started to be condemned as a religious as well as a political leader. And now we have a situation where the Chinese authorities are seeking to erase any manifestation of the Dalai Lama's influence, not only in terms of visual display of an image, but also in terms of in people's minds and hearts, which of course won't be so easy in a resilient population with a deeply rooted sense of cultural and religious identity. And another thing to mention here, perhaps, and we have also heard that work teams have been very active in different parts of Tibet, going around to people's houses, enforcing the display of the pictures of Chinese Communist Party leaders. And of course, in the Tibet Autonomous Region, this has been the case for some years now. In areas outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region, the Tibetan areas of Amdo and Kham are now incorporated into Sichuan, Gansu, Yunnan and Qinghai. There has been a certain amount of space for people to still display pictures of the Dalai Lama, but in areas that's becoming harder as policy is more uniform across all of the Tibetan areas, and these intensified policies are more in evidence. And in relation to the issue of the Dalai Lama's, China's imposition of new doctrinal and legislative measures in which to suppress and eviscerate Tibetan Buddhism. Now, as you know, China put in place measures from 2007 controlling reincarnations. And the concept of reincarnation, of course, is at the heart of Tibetan religious identity. And in 2007, a law was enacted which stated that only the party, the government, could decide who was entitled to reincarnate as a lama. And since then, they have developed systematic mechanisms for training young Tibetans who are recognized officially as lamas and incorporated on a state database of reincarnate tulkus. And now we find that those Tibetan young lamas are incorporated into this system of sinicization from a very young age. And they're taken not to pilgrimage sites for their training, but they're taken to places like Mao's birthplace or sites of particular interest with red tourism, such as different facilities where the party will inculcate its particular view of history. So we can see that these measures of ideological indoctrination have gone deep, and the Chinese Communist Party knows that even those measures are not enough. Banning images of the Dalai Lama, enforcing ideological indoctrination at an early age, even those are not enough. The party needs to maintain other means of ensuring control of a population where people are still very resilient. So this is a Tibetan religion and culture that is very resilient, and people continue to express themselves despite the dangers of doing so.
Thank you. Dr. Jens, you have anything? Would you like to add? You are on mute.
Yeah, just very briefly, we have the same situation, in other parts of China, also with like Christians who are asked to put up the pictures instead of crosses if they want to receive poverty alleviation support. It's the poverty alleviation as a control mechanism, social control mechanism with the whole infrastructure. And I think Finlay's point of the creation of dependency on this. And once you've changed the lifestyle and there's kind of no going back, government permanent and a conditionality that can be attached to that in terms of the elimination also of spiritual practice. If the Uyghurs, they go to factory parks. There are no mosques. They cannot practice their religion there. Christians and Tibetan Buddhists who are forced into different forms and lifestyles, and then it's kind of this uprooting of natural communities and the uprooting from natural connections to land. And of course, with Tibetan Buddhism, especially the spiritual markers of land, this is creating. These are really the multiple layers at which long-term changes are being brought about. So it's a very important topic to look into, this whole poverty alleviation, changed livelihood forms, urbanization, etc. The nexus between all of these things.
Thank you. And Professor Dr. Zen, you have a question from Claudio Cadley, and he is the president of Italy Tibet Association. So he's asking, what do you think and what are the reasons that you think would be, after ignoring the case of Xinjiang for so many years, now the issue of Xinjiang has picked up so quickly, whereas the issue of Tibet somehow obscuring or sidelining the question of Tibet or issue of Tibet, which continues to remain a serious issues and the situation in Tibet continues to remain very serious. So what do you think, and what would be the reason of this?
Well, of course, the reason that Xinjiang has gotten so much attention is just the drastic, dramatic, and virtually unprecedented nature of this internment, putting so many people into. I think that even in the Cultural Revolution, there's like no time in even recent Chinese history where almost such a percentage of an ethnic group has literally been incarcerated for the purpose of extra-legal re-education. Of course, yeah. And with such sophistication and speed, so we have such an unprecedented upscaling. It's like you take the situation in Tibet and you intensify it 10 times, and you make it 10 times worse, and you do it 10 times faster. So I think that's the reason why there's been so much attention. But I think ultimately there are these connections. The topic of Xinjiang is not making the topic of Tibet go away. It has kind of, in some ways, Tibetans have managed to attract very substantial attention. If you look at their relative population size, the Uyghurs have almost double the population in Xinjiang. So it's quite, and of course Xinjiang is a very large area. So in some ways it's quite justified actually to look at the Uyghurs who have been neglected. The plight of the Uyghurs has been very neglected compared to the Tibetans have had the Dalai Lama and other spiritual figureheads to really make a global cause for them. The Uyghurs have not had that. And so in some ways, the shift of attention is in a number of ways necessary. But of course, it's quite true that it's quite true the situation in Tibet continues to be bad and worsening, as the condition, of course, in many places in China is worsening. And so this kind of competition for attention, like Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong now, in some ways it feels like it may be a competition for attention, but at the same time, it's not going away. It's not going anywhere. And Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang remain. They also mutually reinforce each other, and they keep being mentioned. The danger is that the research into the Tibetan situation gets neglected. Hong Kong has so much attention because you got so much image material. In Hong Kong, people take videos. There's a video every day of police. You don't have that in Xinjiang. And in Xinjiang, the media has been able to travel. Despite restrictions, they can at least fly there. Tibet, you can't even get into Tibet without a visa, right? So the reporting situation and also the escaping, at least there were some Uyghurs and Kazakhs who have been able to escape Xinjiang. We have first-hand witness testimony. But the Tibet situation and the border, it's much more closed. There's no witnesses. So the information, the biggest problem about the situation in Tibet is the lack of first-hand information and the flow of information. And so that creates a tricky situation and a danger that assumptions are being made, developments are being missed in Tibet. And so there's a great need for good research on the Tibetan situation.
Thank you very much. So before we move on to the conclusion and the final remark, and I have a very open questions to all our panelists. So all our panelists have very effectively captured and articulate how serious the situation in Tibet is now. So my question is, what are the actions that can be taken by governments, by UN Human Rights Councils, by UN member states to bring China into account? So maybe over to you, Professor Zen, Dr. Zen, yeah.
Yeah, to bring China, to hold China accountable, of course, that's the big problem for Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, the suppression of minority of the Falun Gong, house church Christianity. I mean, there are so many fires burning in, activists, feminists, I mean, China's human rights violations just mounting, and they don't care anymore. They really don't care anymore about what impression they are giving. They're just doing it. They're like, okay, this is our business. You stay out of it. So that, of course, presents itself with a huge challenge. There has to be like an all-out multilateral global effort to make China pay a price for its completely unhindered violation of basic human rights. And that requires a lot of boldness from the international community. I think we almost need to look at the United Nations, the inadequacy of the United Nations mechanisms, with China now actually sitting on the Human Rights Council and making decisions, trying to change the definition of human rights. Chinese influence operations are undermining the very processes by which human rights should be upheld and challenged. So where do you even start from there? I think some of the most effective steps now are political and economic sanctions, for forced labor, for basic violation of political process and human rights, that there have to be, and of course, the United States has kind of gone ahead with that. The United Kingdom is kind of stuck in the middle at the moment, and the European Union has been so pathetic and spineless and ridiculous that they even want to do a strike and investment agreement. You want to say almost on the same day as China is kicking rights with their feet, and the Europeans are like, yeah, let's do more business. Just horrendous timing also on the heels of the forced labor revelations, both in Tibet and Xinjiang, and then the European Union says, oh, this is our time when we will strike a deal. It's so... I'm glad I'm not a human rights how should I put it? It must be so there must be such unlimited frustration among human rights activism over this spinelessness, and where to even begin with that. I think the economic side, looking at lobbying with companies, raising consumer awareness, is one of the steps that can be taken. Mobilizing normal people, it's just increasing awareness, and I think here the Tibetan cause is, I think, benefiting from deafening noise of reporting on the Uyghurs, because it just alerts it reaches even wider populations now about just horrendous it is. I think the Tibetan cause can tack onto that and benefit from the exposure that Chinese human rights violations in Hong Kong and Xinjiang are getting. But yeah, it does take a very creative approach. This is not an easy topic. My goodness, I'm sure Kate and maybe Finlay have more concrete and perhaps more hopeful comments to offer on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. Kate La?
Well, as Adrian says, the challenges are immense, and it's hard to know where to begin to start to tackle some of them. One of the things I would say is that the alliances between the Tibetans, Hong Kong people, the Uyghurs, the Christians, the Falun Gong in some cases, the Catholics, house churches, those alliances have become very powerful in recent years because China's outreach and influence to our own societies has become unavoidable, impossible to ignore now. And I think that there's a sense that if the Uyghurs lose, if the Tibetans lose, if Hong Kong people lose, we all lose. This is a global reevaluation of how we want our societies to be, where we need to stand. And I would defer to Chucky actually on the recommendations advocacy asks for this session of the UN. But I suppose I would just follow up a couple of small details on the Tibet case, which is that in 2016 there was an approach to via the UN mechanisms on the fate of nuns and monks who were expelled from Larangar and Yatchengar, the big monastic institutes in eastern Tibet. And I think there are still a number of questions about those thousands of monks and nuns who were expelled to central Tibetan areas, Tibet Autonomous Region, because of the reports that we've received, very worrying reports of being held in certain centers, forcibly re-educated, nothing like the scale of what's happening in Xinjiang, but some small reliable reports nevertheless. I'd also mention on the language issue the statement in January 2021 that a worrying development from the Chinese National People's Congress, which is China's rubber stamp parliament, about that it's going to be unconstitutional to use spoken and written ethnic minority languages. That set an alarming precedent. Also, Chucky, you mentioned in your comments before about the rapporteur on food, and I believe the last rapporteur on food, Olivier de Schutter, went to the PRC, and he raised a very helpful intervention, which was about connecting food security to land tenure and addressing nomad settlement policies through that. But I would echo Adrian's call for focused and targeted sanctions, also an independent UN investigation. It's extremely problematic now getting information from Tibet, getting first-hand testimony. Adrian's own research has been primarily based on open source because of the difficulty in getting these testimonies. So, Adrian, your recent paper, it would have been very, very different if we'd been able to, in our understanding, if we'd been able to interview Tibetans who had gone through military-style vocational training or similar, in the way that some interviews with survivors of the Uyghur internment system have come through. So different situation. And we saw with the example of the tragic story of Kunchok Jimper, who was killed in custody and who was serving a 21-year sentence for sending the mildest, most moderate news and information about his concerns just outside Tibet. So the dangers are there. And I just conclude with the need perhaps to for UN and other bodies to really tackle the language that China uses, because China uses an opaque smokescreen of language in order to convince governments and UN mechanisms globally that their land use policies and that their strategies of poverty alleviation and so on are aimed at positive things, lifting people out of poverty, climate change, adaptation and mitigation. They justify the settlement of Tibetan nomads through using this type of terminology. To give another example, the construction of massive dams across the plateau is described as water conservation construction. And so I think the language also needs challenging, just as the CCP seeks to subvert and frame the language of human rights discourse.
Thank you. Chilila?
Yes, I was just thinking about what Professor Zen said, that he thinks about what a hopeless time the human rights activists must be going through with the increase of power of China. And in this regard, I would like to say that we have seen several rays of hope. And first of all, what I would like to reiterate this, we have discussed this on several issues, and wherever and whenever we meet the missions and the UN related staffers, we always say that the 50 special rapporteurs actually showed us the way forward to what to do when it comes to human rights situation in China. The joint communication of 50 special rapporteurs specifically asked for appointment or establishment of a country-specific mandate for China to analyze, monitor, and report on the human rights situation and the violations that is happening in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the rest of the regions of China. I think that is a very, very important ask, and I think we should reiterate this whenever possible, wherever possible. And another ask is definitely to hold a special session, because generally we have the regular UNHRC session that is happening, and the UNHRC is capable of holding the special session, and this special session specifically should focus on the human rights situation and the violations that are happening in China, including Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong. And this is not unprecedented. There was a special session per se on racism issues, and there have been multiple before that, so definitely on that. Again, another important anecdote that I would want to share is in the last meeting, online meeting with former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Professor Zaid, when he was asked what can be done, he quoted that, it is time to go back to the basics. I'm just paraphrasing it. It is time to go back to the basic and actually do the work that you are supposed to do accurately and efficiently and timely. I think that's very important, because as simple as ensuring that the special rapporteurs, the staffers, send in requests for a visit to China or visit to Tibet. I think there are so many requests that are lying inactive currently. The visits to Tibet or China in a larger picture. So I think as simple as that. That is with regard to what the UN and UNHRC specifically can do. With regard to the missions, I think what we have learned over the period of time is that there cannot be a bilateral, discussion of any sort on human rights specifically with China, because they talk about cooperation, but they end up co-opting the countries, and therefore multilateral dealings and multilateral forums are the way to go ahead. So whenever there is a UNHRC session, whenever there is a General Assembly session, whenever there is a discussion about human rights violations, I think it is very, very pertinent and important that these missions, like they have done earlier, I think the last General Assembly saw 39 countries coming together and issuing a joint statement. They should continue this practice of issuing a joint statement so that China does not single out a country like what is happening with Australia banning their wine and everything. I think multilateral tackling is the way ahead, and handling China in that way. Thirdly, as Ms. Saunders discussed about the language, I think we have definitely seen how China has been phrasing these vague legal terminologies to, attack on human rights defenders, to ensure that they are charged with unrelated, issues under anti-crime drive or anti-corruption drive. Similarly, it is happening at the UN level as well. There are 2 resolutions sponsored by China. The first one is the mutual benefit cooperation on human rights, and second is the people-centered approach. Now, if you look at these 2 resolutions, you will assume that, oh, these are actually, something to do with human rights and something to, ensure that there is going to be a radical change in how human rights are perceived. However, when you actually read through these resolutions and whatever attempts China is doing at the UN are targeted and concerted efforts of China to ensure that the basic principles of human rights are, rephrased and given new definitions. When the goalpost is always changed, you never know whether you have reached or not. And because of these new definitions of people-centered approach, which are basically ensuring that there is a hierarchy of human rights, and the right to life is negated, whereas right to development is given importance. So as simple as that, ensuring that these resolutions are not allowed to be passed in the assembly and in the council sessions. I think these are few important aspects that we should definitely keep our eyes and ears open and have a look out, especially whatever proposals that come from China. We have to be very, very suspicious and be very careful handling these issues. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our panelists for sharing your thoughts and recommendations on where and how to bring China into account for its unrelentless violations of international and national human rights obligations. So thank you very much. Now, before concluding the virtual side event session, may I invite all our panelists to give your final remark, if you have any. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes for your final remarks on the basis of your presentation. Maybe Ketla?
So maybe I'll conclude on something of a positive note, despite what we've heard today. China's success in implementing these policies and the shift in coercive assimilation, which is unprecedented, their success in this is not entirely assured. And we often hear about the sort of proactive discourse on what they're trying to achieve in Tibet. There's every evidence, nevertheless, that Tibetans do in many ways continue to hold their ground in terms of maintaining their Tibetan religious, cultural, spiritual, linguistic identity with great determination, even as the party drives deeper and deeper into their private life. And now we're also seeing that major policy drives such as resettlement and relocation are being challenged much more, even within China, by Chinese experts, by Chinese policymakers in some areas. So those plans continue to be contested within the PRC and spoken about. And I think what you see is that the very zealous language in which the policies are framed demonstrates how officials often are struggling to impose their political will. And it also indicates their fears about future erosion of their authority.
Thank you. And
I'll stop
Professor,
there.
yeah.
Yes, there are many complex issues here that we're looking at, and it's very different to look on the advocacy side or the research side. I think one of the things is that advocacy that's research-based and fact-based is the most effective, and we all know that. And so the more we are able to find out and keep track of what is happening on the ground in different ways, the more we can have a targeted countermeasures on our end. So if we know, oh, there's a specific new policy, and that's what it is doing, what it probably is doing, it's more specific than to have sort of general accusations, because there's, especially with Tibetan advocacy, oftentimes you have, for a long time, you had very general advocacies about genocide and destruction of population, and some of that turned out not to be true, or maybe it was true for a certain time period. And then you had things you say, okay, religious repression, but what exactly is going on? Or with language education, but what exactly is actually going on with education? So it's always good to have the empirical basis that informs the human rights work and the awareness creation. One of the is when also the media reporting. I'm very grateful I was able, for example, to do this with Reuters. So the media reporting on something in Tibet, the media needs information as well. And then this can spark action. So my hope is that we can have more of these kind of cycles and find out and understand more that can lead then to targeted initiatives and targeted intervention. And I'm joining of forces between the rights violations against religious groups of all kinds in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and Hong Kong. Sort of, and you see those activists from different groups jointly on the streets. Be they in London, be they in other places in America. They all go together, marching next to each other. And I think that is communicating something. There's all these oppressed groups in China. They're all going on the street, shoulder to shoulder. I hope to see more of that, and that we can sort of keep the pace. It's not easy to keep the pace, because China's rights violations are occurring at such a rapid pace that it's an incredible challenge to keep track of them in real time. Anyways, thank you for inviting me to the session, and we keep the Tibetan people in our hearts.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Tilila?
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk. My conclusion would be that, as I said, even in the deepest of deepest darkness and hopelessness, we have found a ray of hope always. And with the blessings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have built a vibrant democracy in exile, and the fight for Tibet, the movement of Tibet, is not going to go away. And when China understands this, it creates distractions. And often during my advocacy, I have been asked by many people, do you see that Tibet is losing focus from the international community? And I say, what is happening in Xinjiang and what is happening in Hong Kong is not in competition to what has happened in Tibet. Because it has happened in Tibet, and because the international community did not take effective action against the perpetrators, it has happened in Xinjiang and it has happened in Hong Kong. Tibet is the patient zero, as mostly referred to as, and as both my co-panelists said, together definitely we will be able to move ahead. And even the international community should realize that they cannot go firefighting with everything. Just because there is a new issue, you do not forget the old issue. You ensure that the old issue is taken together, so that there is a holistic approach to the violations of human rights perpetrated by China, and that there is an ensured effective resolution for these issues and these violations. And for all our brothers and sisters back in Tibet, we see you, we hear you, we feel you, and we will continue to amplify your voices and fight for you. Stay strong.
Thank you very much, Tilila. So now with this, we are coming to the end of the virtual site event to discuss the human rights situation in Tibet. So as I introduced in the beginning, this virtual site event is being organized in parallel the ongoing 46th UN Human Rights Council session here in Geneva. So thank you very much to all our panelists for your expertise. So you all have made this session very interesting, insightful, and very informative. So thank you very much to all our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much. And thank you very much also to all our, of course, live audience, and also those who have asked questions and been with us for all this through this session. And I'm so sorry for holding you for almost 15 minutes. I think we are behind. We were supposed to finish. Now I think we took more than 20 minutes. Okay, so thank you very much. Because of very interesting and engaging discussion that we have, I cannot and I do not wish to actually stop this virtual site event. So thank you very much. And now, last but not the least, thank you very much to our Tibettv team for making this live event possible. And thank you very much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Goodbye.
Thank you.